The issue is, or the statement is, should the secular community support a right to abortion? And arguing in favor of that is Matt Dillahunty, who is a Navy veteran, a former Southern Baptist, and currently deeply involved in the atheist movement in terms of his program that he's just talked about, his weekly show. And so he has worldwide recognition as an atheist. And he has argued with believers on his show over and over again, and probably many times about this very issue, about abortion. Arguing against the issue, the question of should the secular community support a right to abortion is Kristine Kruszelnicki, who has literally just flown in from Canada, and boy are her arms tired. Kaboom, ching. And she is an outreach coordinator with Secular Pro-Life there. She's been an activist there. She has published on this issue many times in Canada, and has studied early childhood development and is active in Canada on this issue. I would like to begin with Matt with his opening statement.
So first of all, before I actually start, thank you all for coming here. I want to thank Kristine for agreeing to the debate, Nick Lee for graciously agreeing to moderate, and the Texas Free Thought Convention for being brave enough to put a debate in this format, and all of you for taking the time to attend a debate on an issue that isn't the slightest bit controversial or contentious. Much of the time when we debate complicated topics, we take advantage of a tool that philosopher Daniel Dennett has creatively dubbed an intuition pump. These are thought experiments that present analogous situations designed to strip away the distractions and allow our intuitions to more easily grasp the heart of the matter. The problem with this tool is that it's possible to strip away important information and guide people toward an incorrect answer as well. When it comes to this particular subject, both sides have made use of this tool, and it's likely that you're familiar already with some of the many popular intuition pumps. Many of you may be familiar with the violinist analogy in support of the bodily rights argument. An alternate version of that, which I much prefer, simply asks if a parent should be legally required to donate a kidney to their child. This intuition pump adds a further concession in that the parent willingly procreated with the knowledge that there was some non-zero risk of passing on a rare kidney disease that would require this procedure from the parent to save the child's life. Many people might consider that parent a moral monster for refusing to donate a kidney, but I've yet to see any sound justification for legally requiring the donation, and the morality of the situation and the legal responsibility are separate issues. But no intuition pump or analogy is likely to be perfect, and I expect that we could spend days poking holes in each other's analogies. The fact of the matter is that pregnancy is pregnancy, and it's not quite like anything else. And we'll all make use of analogies to clarify points. It's also important that we discuss this issue plainly. The process of reproduction that our species has evolved to make use of could better be described as the process that makes use of us. Pregnancy is an involuntary condition that results from our natural biological drives and interactions, and is often in conflict with our desires, our designs, and our best interests. It's something that happens to us, not by us. It's also a condition that is not without significant risk. We become a bit spoiled in our modern world. Pregnancy in first world countries is often viewed as a somewhat trivial endeavor. Medical advances in countries like the United States have reduced maternal mortality rates by 2 orders of magnitude in less than a century. In 2010, the maternal mortality rate in the United States was 24 per 100,000. Another study has this at 8.8 per 100,000. For contrast, the mortality rate for abortion from the same study is listed as 0.6 per 100,000, making abortion vastly safer than carrying a baby to term, even in the modern world. A fact any group worthy of calling themselves pro-life should recognize and consider. Pregnancy risks increase as gestation progresses, and the effects on the woman should not be understated. Women who carry a child to term undergo permanent, irreversible changes that range from scarring to incontinence and further, and each pregnancy increases some of the risks for future pregnancies. We're here to talk about the debate on the right to abortion. And I'll start by saying that I suspect that Kristine and I already agree that a right to abortion should exist. We just disagree on the limits of that right. We may not agree, though. It may be that she doesn't support a right to abortion under any circumstances. I'm not fully familiar with her position, and I can't wait to hear it. And I won't claim any technical victory if it turns out that we do agree and we're just working around the limitations, because the limitations are important and they're worth discussing. Deciding the limits has always been the cornerstone of this discussion. This is about rights, though, not moral views. For example, I disagree with Vice President Joe Biden on questions related to the morality of abortion, but I'm happy to hear that he understands that his personal religious opinions about the morality of the situation should not permit him to impose those views on others as a matter of law. Unfortunately, some people are advocating the criminalization of abortion. When it comes to determining what sort of rights we're going to grant people, there are two primary methods. The first is that we begin with no rights and are free only to exercise the rights that we specifically enumerate. The second is that we begin with all rights except for those that we specifically limit. The first option is patently absurd. Where did you get the right to begin defining rights in the first place? The second requires that we focus our attention on how and why we're going to restrict certain rights, which rights take priority, and what do we do when rights come in conflict. The right to bodily autonomy is one of the most foundational principles that has guided this process. When a proposed restriction would violate this right, there's a very heavy burden to overcome before that violation can be justified. We tend to limit rights at the boundary of the individual. One person's right to swing their fist at some point ends at some point prior to contacting somebody else's nose. And I'd argue that even if we were to go so far as to declare the fetus a person, a huge irrational mistake in my opinion, that fetus's right to swing its umbilical cord ends somewhere prior to the wall of the uterus. When it comes to pregnancy, there are a lot of potential rights to be considered, and it may be the case that there's no compromise that will be satisfactory to all parties. The nature of the situation may be such that there are always going to be irreconcilable conflicts. For example, we've heard some men claim that they should have the right to opt out of their parental responsibilities. That's a discussion worth having, and there may or may not be room for improvement and compromise. But that compromise should never result in forcing a woman to have an abortion or in forcing her to carry a fetus to term. The arguments opposing a woman's right to choose or right to terminate a pregnancy tend to rely on claims of personhood for the embryo or fetus, and some claim of parental responsibility on the part of a pregnant woman. The arguments from parental responsibility are nothing more than question begging and naturalistic fallacies. They assume the very thing they're trying to prove. Labeling a woman a parent in order to saddle someone with a pregnant woman a parent in order to saddle them with parental responsibilities is akin to calling the universe creation in order to claim that it needs a creator. They also try to claim that the natural consequences of becoming pregnant automatically imbue you with the responsibility to care for that life, while flatly denying that terminating a pregnancy is an act of taking responsibility for the condition you find yourself in. Moreover, parental responsibility still should never compel the use of someone else's body. The arguments for personhood not only suffer from question begging and naturalistic fallacies, they're also similarly irrelevant. As the bodily rights argument demonstrates, you may be morally virtuous and lauded as a hero for doing so, but you should not be legally compelled to run into a burning building to rescue someone. One person should not be compelled by law to risk their life, donate organs, or even sacrifice their health or happiness in order to benefit another. Legal obligations of this kind necessarily sacrifice one person's rights in favor of another's. Moreover, personhood extends beyond abortion and addresses issues of contraception and personal choices about health. Now, I don't think that Kristine is evil. I haven't met her, apart from just saying hi on the hallway. I don't think she woke up one day and said, yeah, you know, I really want to stick it to those pregnant women. Kristine probably doesn't want to hurt women, but the positions that she's advocating have that effect. And I don't know what a rationalization for this is, but I intend to find out this evening. How is it that one ignores the rights, desires, freedoms, health, and humanity of a living, breathing, thinking, feeling person in favor of another person let alone in favor of a handful of cells or a developing fetus that is neither viable or conscious. It's likely that you'll hear appeals to the value of life, things like it's human, it's alive, it's equal. But is it really? When we talk about the value of life, we're not talking about the value of a heartbeat. We're talking about the value of experiencing life, living life, awareness. Terry Schiavo was dead long before anybody pulled the plug, and a fetus, while it is as alive as a mass of cancer cells, under one definition, is not alive in the sense that it is not reasonably equivalent. Consider teratomas, which include organs, unique organs. How do you make that distinction? The biological complexities of this situation are staggering. Recently, I love babies. My wife and I are considering having one. Just the day before yesterday, we were in the office. We're going to have to use in vitro fertilization, which does raise some questions for tonight as well. And he was going through the process, and one of the steps that they do for some people is about the third day, the embryo is 8 cells, and they just go in and remove one of those 8 cells and test it to make sure that everything's going to work out all right. Can I remove an 1/8 of you? Are we equal in the sense that a mass of 8 cells, you can remove an 1/8 of it and everything works out fine? Kristine must come up with a compelling reason to violate a woman's right to bodily autonomy. We atheist, secular, free-thinking community should support a right to abortion, as should every human, because we don't have sufficient cause to deny that right. Yes, we can continue to debate the specifics, but we first have to support some right to abortion in order to be able to begin drawing the line. Grant all rights, revoke with good reasons, and I have yet to see any good reason to deny the right of a woman to terminate a pregnancy. This is the burden of proof that Kristine and those who want to outlaw a woman's right to choose must meet. And I did 20 seconds in your 30 seconds, but I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt.
So it's damn iPhones.
Now an opening statement from Kristine.
Well, first of all, I want to thank Matt for having requested that I come and debate with him. I was quite thrilled to have the opportunity to be able to share my views with the atheist community, since this issue is often framed under religious arguments. I also want to thank the Texas Free Thought Convention for having made this available. Like Matt stated, it's obviously a controversial issue, and it's a difficult one. I also want to thank anyone in this room, specifically who has been involved in an abortion decision. I realize that some of the things that I might say today maybe seem hurtful or shameful, and I want to express that it's not my intention to cause you shame or pain, but I do hope that we can look at these issues honestly, and that as intelligent people and free thinkers, that we can look at science and reason and come to a logical conclusion on this issue. So, as Matt accurately said, pregnancy is pregnancy, and we have to define what is it, really, before we get down to it. Before we can decide whether abortion is a right that we should support or a wrong that we should oppose, we do need to be able to define our terms. And I've got a little cartoon here that shows, what could happen when we don't properly define our terms. And for anybody who can't see that, we've got 2 children here, and one of them is saying, "Mommy said that pregnant means carrying a child. Look at Mr. Cleary, he's pregnant." You know, clearly these children are confused. And I think that's something that can happen to a lot of us in this issue, is that we get into talking about, for instance, choice. But yet, if we don't define what that choice is, we can say, well, I'm pro-choice, I'm anti-choice, but really, what's the choice? And so, in order to really pursue this issue accurately, I believe we have to ask 2 questions. The first is, what is the fetus? And the second is, what is the unborn? Because ultimately, I agree with Matt. This is the problem with having someone else running your PDF. I agree with Matt on everything that he has just said. I think that we should trust women. I think that we should respect the right to privacy. I think that we shouldn't be forcing women to have dangerous surgery if we make abortion illegal. I think that all these things are absolutely accurate and true, and that abortion should be safe and it should be legal, and all these things are a fact if the preborn are not human beings. Because ultimately, it does boil down to that. If abortion does not kill a human being, then no justification for abortion is necessary. But if abortion does kill a human being, then no justification for abortion is adequate. And if we look ahead I've got this little video here, it's from 9 weeks embryoscopy, and it may or may not load on its own, so don't worry about it. No, not that one. Stop. Go back to the video, please. Technology, isn't it a beautiful thing? Sometimes you have unplanned things that happen in your life. All right, skipping the video. We do have to ask the question of what isn't. So turning to biology, we see that the law of biogenesis, the principle of biogenesis, says that every creature reproduces after its own kind. So life comes from life. And because all living things reproduce after their own kind, from a biological standpoint, what is inside the uterus, because it came from two human beings, cannot be anything else than a human being. We also know from science, we basically look at what the embryo is based on cell composition and cell behavior. When we look at an embryo, for instance, as compared to sperm or ovum, we see that the embryo is comprised of 46 chromosomes, sperm and ovum and other skin cells sperm and ovum are composed of 23 chromosomes each. They're differentiated cells, just the same way as someone says, well, if you scratch your arm, aren't you committing genocide? No, you're not, because those are differentiated cells. They are different kinds of cells. Second of all, we look at cell behavior. We look at an embryo, and even at a single cell, the embryo is different from sperm and ovum because the sperm and ovum each have their own function. The sperm's function is to go search for the ovum's function is to be hospitable to the sperm. Once the two of them have merged, you have a new entity that has a completely new function. That function with its inherent code is to develop itself through all stages of human development. Go ahead. So we know that from science we can see the embryo is alive. Life comes from life. It has human parents, so it's a human. Human DNA determining its code right from the beginning of fertilization, whether it's going to be male, female, what particular personality traits it might have. And we also know that the embryo is whole, unlike sperm and egg, which are parts of human beings. So we can't say that it's a potential human. It's not a potential human. It's a human with great potential. I just want to quickly look at science. I'm going to skip through these really quickly because I think we're... Oh, my stopwatch didn't start. Okay, you'll have to tell me how my time is doing. My stopwatch didn't start. This is a highly specialized totipotent cell marked the beginning of each of us as a unique individual. Zygote formed by the union of oocyte and sperm is the beginning of new human life. You can go ahead and run through these really quickly. Just skip ahead. Just skip through them. Okay, go back. So obviously science has said that human life begins at fertilization. This is not something that pro-lifers are inventing. This is not propaganda. This is already biologically determined. But then you say, well, hold on a second. There are significant differences between a fertilized embryo and a born person. And I would actually agree with you. However, there are significant differences between a born person and an adult. So between the fertilized embryo and birth, they're different in size, obviously, different level of development, environment, and degree of dependency. However, when you look at it, all of these differences are also the same differences that exist between a born person and an adult. Is it skipping? There we go. So as we will change in size, level of development, environment, and degree of dependency from fertilization to birth, we will also do the same from birth to adulthood. So size, yes, a fetus is much smaller than a born person. But then again, an infant or a toddler is much smaller than a woman, who is much, often smaller than a man. But we don't say that our value is determined based on our size. So value is not determined for any of us past the birth marker. Why should that be determined? Why should size be the marker before birth? Level of development. Yes, of course, a fetus is extremely less developed. Matt raised a few points on consciousness and brain. And yes, so how much time do I have?
Oh, you're good. You're about 3 minutes, about 2.5.
2.5, okay, wow. So level development, yes, they're a lot less developed. But then again, a toddler is much less developed than a teenager, and we don't say that because they're less developed, they're less valuable. Same thing can be said with environment. We change locations all throughout our life, but where we are doesn't make who or what we are. And finally, degree of dependency. Yes, a fetus is much more dependent than any of us, but that degree of dependency will change over the course of our lives. Sometimes we'll become more dependent or less dependent over the course of our lifetime. Dependency is not what makes us valuable. Go ahead. So ultimately, we have to ask the question, the second question, after we've asked what is the fetus, we have to ask what is abortion. So if you can go ahead and play the other video. So I'm going to show a very brief video, and it has graphic visuals, so feel free to close your eyes if you don't want to see that, because I think that we need to honestly ask the question. It's not a question of whether this is emotional, it is. But as Naomi Wolf has said, we have to, if these pictures are true, then they should be admitted as evidence. So just to quickly wrap up, ultimately, Matt's argument is sound and solid if that's not a human being. Because if that is a human being, then ultimately we have to respect that life as much as any other. And all the rights and obligations that we would give to a born woman, we also have to be extending to a preborn child, the basic elementary right to not be killed. All right, take us up.
Thank you, Kristine. In the second round, we have 5 minutes of rebuttal, and first from Matt.
So I'm glad that my argument is sound if that's not a human being. My position is the bodily rights argument is sound even if that's a human being. That's the whole point of the bodily rights argument. The whole point of that question about whether or not a parent should be required to donate a kidney to a child is to demonstrate that there's a difference between the requirements of parenthood and what you're required to do with your own body. Now, there's a quote, and I guess PZ can check me for accuracy because I just heard it today, but evidently PZ at one point had said that he didn't care if the fetus was conscious and writing poetry, it still doesn't have a right to use the woman's body. I'm assuming that's accurate, if he's still in here. Is that the bar? Yes. I don't always go that far in actually discussing it because there are nuances that I would like to actually consider. The problem is that as far as I can tell, and we'll have to get some more specifics in the Q&A, my opponent's position is not particularly complex. It's a life, it's human, it's unique, don't kill it. Abortion is murder, let's outlaw it. Abortion is the termination of a pregnancy. It is something that I think could arguably be considered self-defense in many cases. And not just when your life is necessarily in danger. You have the right to defend yourself in all sorts of situations. But the bodily rights argument specifically addresses this issue of personhood, whether or not there's an individual. So my argument isn't sound depending on whether or not it's a human. It completely, I could acknowledge, I could grant, as a matter of course, yes, the fetus is a person, and let's give it every right a person has. I won't do that because I think that's stupid. But I could do that, and it still wouldn't change the facts that this is now we are in a situation where there are two persons whose rights are in conflict, and we must come to some reconciliation. The point that I didn't get to make in the opening is that denying women this basic human right makes them slaves to their biology. It attempts to justify this thinly veiled naturalistic fallacy, basically amount to, yes, you're pregnant and you don't want to be, that must be terrible for you. I'm sorry that nature has screwed you over, but that's the way it has to stay. unless we find that your life is at risk, I'm assuming you do make an exception in the case of the mother's life?
If there is no other, yeah. Oh,
Yeah. Well, I shouldn't have asked a question. Sorry. Cheating. But unless there is some exception, and then we'll set aside nature and all of our principles and all the arguments that we made before about how it's a human and you can't kill it, and we'll go ahead and do that, because now maybe we realize that there's some self-defense going on. I've got, what, 2 minutes?
Yeah,
Cool.
2 minutes.
The graphic that she showed, beginning with a fertilized embryo and ending with a 20-year-old, and the argument of saying that there are similar differences between a 20-year-old and a newborn as there are between a newborn and a newly fertilized egg is nifty. But there's more than just size, level of dependence. And I didn't raise the question of value. My issue of value is that we must value an individual's rights to sovereignty and bodily autonomy. And that we don't have the right to force you to donate a kidney or an arm. We don't have the right to force you to be pregnant. There are a number of complicated and difficult questions that we have to ask, and some of them I hope actually we get the chance to ask and discuss tonight. But at the end of the day, I didn't call this a potential human. I'm happy for the sake of arguments in some limited arguments to call it, I guess, a potential person, because there's some debate about whether or not we're going to give it the rights of a person. But even if we do, that doesn't in any way change the nature of the discussion. I can have a kid, and I do not have any obligation to donate blood, kidneys, or make use, or allow them to make use of my body. And by the way, I'm speaking on behalf of women. The irony of a man speaking on this issue has not escaped me. But for the people who think that I don't have a dog in this hunt, I have a wife, I potentially have daughters, I have mothers, I have friends. This is an issue that every human being should care about. I'm at 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good. Then we turn to Kristine for another 5 minutes of rebuttal.
Okay, I'm glad that Matt actually raised the point of the question of value, because really this does come down to how we value human beings. And ultimately, when I look around the room here, and you guys can feel free to do the same, you're going to see a lot of people who are different colors, different sizes, different shapes, different genders. And ultimately, what is it that makes us all equal? It really boils down to one thing: our common humanity. And so, yeah, Matt is correct that we can talk about rights being in conflict, and we could talk about how labeling pregnant women is unfair, labeling pregnant women as parents is unfair, and that making a comparison and asking, are we equal, is unfair if we're talking about a fetus. And he's right, if the preborn are not human beings. Because if they are human beings, then yeah, you are a parent, even when it's prenatal. And yeah, you do have basic obligations to that child, even when that child is living inside you. So let me go into that a little bit more. Matt asked whether a parent was legally required to donate a kidney. And I would say that no. And the reason that is because we have to look at what is the nature of the kidney versus what is the nature of the uterus. A parent is not obligated to donate their kidney because the kidney exists for their body, in their body for their body. However, the uterus exists around a body for someone else's body. And yeah, if that fetus is a human being, then that is their uterus, that is their home, that is their environment. Nature has ultimately designed us from an evolutionary standpoint that that's the only way that our species can live. And so at that age and stage of development, a fetus is in his or her rightful environment. That's where she's supposed to grow, that's where she's supposed to be. Matt talked about pregnancy happening to us, not by us. But here's an interesting thing to consider. Pregnancy is not, or the fetus is not the cause of pregnancy, it's the result of pregnancy. And if you, are, as a parent, have put a child in a situation in which they are dependent, for instance, going into a burning building was another better analogy that Matt had used. Yeah, you may not be obligated to go into a burning building to save someone's life, but what if you had set the building on fire? What if you had put that person in a position where their life was in jeopardy? Talking more again about the bodily rights thing, calling abortion the withholding of support, as some abortion advocates do, is like calling suffocation the withholding of oxygen. Because ultimately, artificially, attaching somebody to their kidney, that is an artificial situation in which is absolutely not comparable to pregnancy, because in a pregnancy, like I said, the fetus is in their natural environment. Yes, so there's rights in conflict. And ultimately, that right is autonomy for 9 months versus the life of the fetus forever. And parents do have basic obligations to their children. They have an obligation not to do extraordinary things like take them to Disney World, but they do have an obligation to feed and to shelter them. And so if that fetus is their child, their human being, prenatally, then they've got a basic obligation to shelter and to feed them prenatally. And finally, Matt had talked a little bit about parental rights and obligations for men. Now, men may have the possibility of saying, well, hey, I did not consent to having my sperm used. I did not have consent to being a father. However, that doesn't give them the right to then kill that child upon which that human being after the child's born. They can't say, well, I don't want to pay child support. I don't want to be responsible for this child. Therefore, I'm going to cut off my parental support to this child and kill that child. And ultimately, withholding support from a fetus and saying, well, I'm not going to give you my body, it's not the same thing as a kidney, because withholding support actively kills that child. So it's a totally different situation. It's as if instead of saying, well, I'm going to deny my kid, my time is up, so I'll explain that more later.
Oh, that was the 30 seconds.
Oh, 30 seconds. It looks like a 0. Okay. So it's instead of saying, I'm going to deny you the right to my kidney, it's as if that parent said, well, I'm going to actively kill you.
Thank you. And now in the third round, each side will have 5 minutes to direct questions to the other side. And we'll begin again with Matt.
So one of the problems with debates is that typically you try not to bring up new arguments or address side arguments in the rebuttal, because when are you going to address them? So quick questions. You don't support any exception for rape or incest, correct?
I believe that if it's a human being, then it doesn't matter how they were conceived or who their parents are.
I'll take that as a yes. And you don't draw any lines, for example, between conception and implantation. Conception is the point.
Well, according to science, and every piece of science that I showed up on the screen, that is when human life begins,
Sure.
Yes.
So do you support contraception that blocks implantation?
If fertilization has already occurred, then implantation is essentially starving that child of its proper nutrients and oxygen.
But you do make an exception for the life of the mother when the mother's life is an immediate risk?
If the woman's life is an immediate risk and it's a pre-viability, then both the mother and the child will die. And so ultimately, we have to do the greatest good, which is to save as many lives as we can, even if the unfortunate result is that the fetus is lost.
So what should the penalty be when we make this illegal?
The penalty should be the same as when a woman kills a born child, and that answer is it depends. We've got many cases of women who are in jail for life. You've got cases of women who have killed and drowned their children who are found not guilty or by reason of insanity. There are women who are given the death penalty. I don't agree with the death penalty, but I'm saying that whatever application that we would give to a mother who's killed a born child.
It's treated as murder or whatever equivalent.
Right. So the answer really is it depends. But yes, there should be a consequence the same as a woman who kills a born child if they're human beings.
So what about when there's severe risk to the health of the mother? Is that not good enough?
Well, ultimately, the health of the mother is something that is so basically you're looking at a competing hierarchy where every abortion is dangerous for the fetus, the child in question. So if it's a human being and the life of the mother or the health of the mother is threatened, you'd really have to look into it by case because health according to the
who looks into that? What is your proposed system of determining what risk is sufficient enough, and why does somebody else get to make that decision instead of the woman and her doctor?
Ultimately, it isn't someone else who makes the decision. Ultimately, it's the doctor who would have to say if her life is immediately threatened by this pregnancy. Unfortunately, the way that the law is set up right now, health is so wide that you could pretty much drive a truck through it.
Well, I mean,
health is anything from my emotions, my mental health, my
hang on. What I'm saying is that you said ultimately nobody else is going to make that decision, but you're saying that the doctor makes the decision.
I'm saying that. Are you speaking in reference to abortion being safer?
When is it a sufficient health risk? How do we determine that? And why is that not a decision for the woman to make on her own or with the help of her doctor? And what right does this doctor have to make that decision? You're talking about making this illegal, and I'm trying to figure out how we sort through all these myriad situations in order to determine penalties.
Ultimately, the issue of health, like I said, is we really have to weigh the two in the balance. Are we talking about health being like emotional health, being financial health? Because a lot of these factors are often brought into play to justify abortion on demand.
And personally,
and so I'm asking you specifically, like to properly answer your question. Are you talking about a health that will threaten the woman's life, or are you just talking about emotional health? And
I don't know. I'm asking what your system is because I think that they should all be considered. And the majority of places where abortion is allowed under certain circumstances, 67% of them allow things like mental health and women's health to be considered. And you don't seem to be willing to do that. So I'm wondering if you had any idea about
When it comes to health, if the health is immediately threatening the life of the woman, then that is something that is worth taking into account the same way that if it's an ectopic pregnancy and her life is immediately threatened, then yeah, you don't want to lose both lives. You want to at least save one life. But ultimately, we have to remind ourselves that there is another human life in the balance. And if that life is there, then we have to then we're talking about the life of one versus the life of the other.
I got you.
If one's in jeopardy, one's actually going to die.
I've only got a couple seconds left. So what about in vitro fertilization? Is it okay to freeze embryos?
That in and of itself is not a problem. It's what we do with them
Because we could
after.
freeze human beings too then, right?
And I believe that we should be using them. If we're going to be freezing them...
well, I mean, if it's right to freeze an embryo, then it should be right to freeze a human.
No, because why are we able to freeze an embryo? It has to do with the fact that they are younger. We obviously can't do that.
Well, this is about rights, not the specific nature of it.
Technology is different, but doesn't mean that one isn't a human.
Aren't you just acknowledging that there's a difference between an embryo and a human?
But that's because they're younger.
Okay.
Good. Now we turn to Kristine, who has 5 minutes to direct questions to Matt.
Okay. Matt, a recent article came out talking about how sex selection abortions are happening and are quite prominent.
Sorry, I didn't hear that.
A recent article came out talking about sex selection abortions and how they are happening on an increasing basis even in North America. Women who are predominantly from Asian descent, Asian or Indian, where they have different values. Do you have any problem with that, with women discriminating against other women?
With women
through abortion?
Do I have any problem with abortions based on sexual selection, the preference of the parents? Mm-hmm. No.
Okay. Do you have any problem if there was found to be a gay gene that people were aborting based on the sexual orientation of the fetus?
I don't know how that you could possibly determine that, but no.
Okay. So ultimately, you would be fine with people, homophobic parents and sexist parents killing their preborn children just because they're gay or just because they're female?
I might consider them immoral, but I'm not willing to violate their right to determine if and when they're going to procreate and if and when they terminate a pregnancy.
Okay. I'm wondering if you can explain to me, do you actually believe that the preborn is human? Like it sounds like you're saying that they're not.
I think that we've equivocated on what human means. I think if you talk about human in
Like
the sense
us,
of
a
biologically
human-
human, yes, but we've also, and tonight you've used human in more than just the biological sense to talk about persons and human interactions that go beyond that.
Human being somebody like us. Like, at what point do you think we become human beings?
That's what I'm saying, is it depends on how you're going to define human being. If you're going to define human as biological, then we're biological from the instant of conception.
Human person. When do we become human?
When do we become a
persons?
person? Now that's a difficult question. And I think that pregnancy is the process of going from a fertilized egg to something that qualifies as a person, and that we can try to make our best judgments about that. But the fact that we can't necessarily draw a quick and easy line, like, the day that it pops out of a womb, or 10 days before, or 20 days before, doesn't mean that we can't make a determination that there is a difference between day 2 and week 38.
So if you don't know then when a person begins, is it not possible that you might be killing a person?
Well, what I said was, first of all, that personhood is irrelevant to my issue of bodily rights. My defense of bodily rights takes into account the idea of a person, and that this is not an issue for that. But what I just said was that even though we can't make a necessarily distinct moment, that doesn't mean we're blind. That doesn't mean we don't have any information to consider. We know roughly about the development of embryos. PZ could explain it to people.
So what, can I just ask you, what is so significant about a preborn fetus that they should not be, in your mind, giving equal bodily rights to the woman?
They have, I would say, equally bodily rights as the woman. They just don't have the right to use her body.
Okay, but
that is equality.
Now, you're kind of begging the question, because a parent, as I said, does have the obligation to nurture their child. So yes, the parent,
you
the
can
child does have the
abdicate
right.
parental rights, and termination of a pregnancy is one of the ways in which you can abdicate those rights.
You can abdicate parental rights, but you can't kill your children. If you abdicate parental rights by saying, I'm going to place my child for adoption, or I'm going to withdraw child support, that's not the same as killing the child.
Right, and neither really is abortion. We're talking about the termination of a pregnancy. It is a fact of nature that this tends to result in the death of the fetus. There are also cases in late-term abortions and late-term forced deliveries where we actually have a vested interest in the viable fetus.
Right, so that's my question then. If it results in the death of the fetus, what is the fetus, and why is the fetus not able to be considered equally valid to not being killed? Why is there not another way that we can
Because
do
it's
it?
not about not being killed, it's about whether or not you get to use somebody else's body. And the fact that you happen to die when we deny you the right to use somebody else's body is not the woman's fault.
Well, the woman is actually the one who has put that child in the position of dependence on her.
So,
Yeah.
No. So all sex is consensual, and all consent to sex is consent to pregnancy? Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm saying that
Then it's not the woman's
body,
responsibility. As you said at the beginning, sometimes unintended things happen to us.
the woman's body has been receptive. This is what I said earlier on about the nature and the function of the uterus. The human body is made to be an environment in which a fetus begins human life. And so therefore, by cutting off that life by cutting off access to that body, the woman is in fact denying basic rights, basic nutrients to that child.
Yes.
That she would be obligated to do post-birth. And so why post-birth? Is it any different than pre-birth?
Yes, it's different in post-birth because it's no longer the woman's body. Your odd situation.
You're begging the
time.
question, though, because...
Thank you both. We're now at the point. We're now at the point we can have some time for audience questions. Again, I caution you, I'd like to get to the question, and we don't need audience pontificating, just ask the question in about 60 seconds. I have the use of 2 mics, so I would like a volunteer, and I just found one.
Check.
And we'll try to cover the room with those
Check.
with these 2. You stay on that side, I'll stay on this side.
Yes, and make sure it's a question as much as we can. I'm going to start over here with our gentleman, Sergio from Houston.
I would just like to know how each of y'all define the word abortion.
I define it as the termination of a pregnancy. Said so.
Abortion is an act of violence that dismembers, decapitates, and kills a human being.
Excellent. Hello, Matt. Daniel right here. It's not a problem. It's such an honor to be here. Thank you very much. As we all understand a philosophical background, Aristotle's Ethics at the very beginning, trying to establish a baseline for certainty, said that we will study a discipline to the extent to which certainty is possible, and that's going to be basically dependent on the discipline. Earlier, your response to Kristine's question about when is a human being become a person, it's a difficult question because it's like, where are you going to get to? Well, earlier you challenged Kristine about, so when can you draw the line about where the mother's life is endangered, that you would go ahead and basically establish that threshold. Would you agree that similarly as in your case, your argument is valid because just because it's inscrutable or it's difficult to determine, that doesn't negate the entire case? Would you allow that to Kristine as well?
Well, I would agree that just because something's difficult doesn't mean it concedes the case, but my purpose of asking the question of where do you draw the lines on these issues of health is to point out not just where do you draw the line, where does Kristine draw the line, but how do you go about making this determination and who gets to decide this? I'm in favor of liberty and in favor of a woman having the right to make decisions about their own body. And Kristine's position seems to be that for 9 months the uterus just doesn't belong to her.
At the beginning, my question's for Matt. You said that you thought that endowing a fetus with all the rights of personhood was stupid. Mm-hmm. Why?
Well, it's kind of complicated, but the shortest version, the question was about endowing the fetus with the full rights of personhood. The more obvious things are, how does this change our entire view of the statistics? How do we determine birth rates and death rates? How do we determine rights? Where do we begin to draw lines? There are certain things that are involved with being a person with rights. And also, I mean, not just statistics. It's not just, we've got to start over from scratch with some of our numbers about, mortality rates. It increases the complexity, and it does so, in my opinion, unjustly. The point that I made about, withdrawing 1/8 of an embryo in order to test it, obviously we can't do that to a human. There are distinctions between the two that need to be recognized. And to the question of personhood, while I can't draw a line on this particular day of a pregnancy it becomes a person, that doesn't mean that I can't say justifiably that on day 2 it's not a person. But the bodily rights argument says that even if on day 2 you consider it a person, it still doesn't give them that right. So.
Can I answer to that as well?
Sure.
Okay. Yeah, just to respond to what Matt just said about the mortality rate, that we wouldn't be able to count them and it would change the numbers. Well, yeah, but just because we can't count them doesn't mean we can kill them. If the preborn are human beings, we don't have to be legally justifying the ongoing continuation, the ongoing experimentation on their bodies, and the ongoing killing of them. Distinctions between the two, absolutely, yeah. So we can't freeze a human being, a born human being, and we can't divide 1/8 of their body and test, a cell. But why are there distinctions? That's something that Matt hasn't really addressed. Why are there distinctions between the two? And really, it boils down to this: it's because they're younger. And so ultimately, abortion really is ageism.
I'm sorry, I shouldn't have laughed like that. That was unfair.
Feel free to respond.
Well, I don't want to necessarily go back and forth, but, let the audience ask questions.
This is for you. Murder, as defined by the dictionary, is the unlawful, premeditated killing of one human being by another. So any abortion would be, by your definition, would be murder. Does that mean that the 70% of pregnancies, even unknowing by the mother, that end in miscarriage, is that involuntary manslaughter?
No, because human beings die naturally. Just because human beings die naturally doesn't mean that we can then say, well, because some infants die from sudden infant syndrome, we can consider infants not valuable and kill them. So likewise, just because a number of pregnancies end in miscarriage doesn't mean that we can qualify and classify the preborn as not human and kill them.
And before we get to the next question, I'm going to respond to that. It's a great question, and you kind of shirked the whole issue, which is, how did you find out that this miscarriage was a natural thing? Aren't we going to have to begin investigating every miscarriage once we make it illegal for women to control their own bodily functions? And investigate all of them to make sure that they didn't break the law?
Again, just because there are logistical issues in not being able to count them, not being able to investigate them, doesn't mean we can continue to justify what we have now, which is an ongoing situation where we're legally able to kill them and experiment on their embryonic bodies.
Okay, the next question we have from Dedan from Sierra Vista, Arizona.
First, that was a great question, by the way. In fact, I was kind of thinking along the same lines. You know, is an abortion then a crime scene? You know, I mean, really, I mean, what you're proposing then is an entirely new set of legislation that enacts laws with punishments that we have to investigate every one of the abortions to determine
well,
whether,
no, you don't.
Not an abortion, but determine whether a miscarriage was the responsibility of the mother. Did it happen because she wasn't taking care of herself? I mean, in that case, if you see a mother smoking a cigarette, can she be in prison for that? Can we put a law against, I mean, you're saying that's a person inside of her. Is that child abuse? Can we put them in prison?
Okay, let me say it again. I fully agree with you that because the preborn is in a unique environment, these are very difficult situations. Yeah, we won't be able to monitor and question and investigate, but there's a big difference between these logistical issues and completely saying, well, fine, we're going to blow open the curtain and say it's perfectly fine to kill them. When we made slavery illegal, and when we ultimately took civil rights and all throughout history, when we have made huge changes in society, people have said, you know, this is completely impossible. You can't do that. It'll be financially impossible. It'll be socially impossible. These social structures are completely going to change. You can't do it. And my answer is, as humanists, we know that we continually to evolve as people. We continually evolve, and I believe that if the preborn are biologically human beings, as I determined earlier, then they are valuable, and we have an obligation to protect them and to change our society to help women in better ways than killing their children.
To be fair, I agree with her and concede that the logistical issues are separate from the moral issues and from the legal issues. But I don't think that they're worthy of being ignored. And I think that they get to the heart of the questions that we're trying to ask. And that is, where does one person's bodily rights end with respect to somebody else's? And we keep glossing over that, and every response that Kristine's offered goes back to, it's a person, it's a person, it's a person, don't kill it, without any regard for the bodily rights of the other person. And the question about whether or not a woman should be investigated for drinking or smoking or not taking prenatal vitamins or whatever that might have resulted in this, and whether or not it should be a criminal offense, is an issue of bodily rights. It's not simply logistics.
Question here? Yeah. Kristine,
Yes.
You've argued that a pregnant woman has a special responsibility. In fact, you used the word obligation to a unborn fetus because she created it. I assume that's why you want to give it the parental rights. What about the counter argument that she has a special authority over something that could not exist without violating her rights, using her body, using her nutrients, altering her body, and threatening her life potentially?
That's an excellent question. Thank you for raising that. Ultimately, it comes down to this. The woman has great power because she has ultimately, she is in a situation where she has caused the existence of a human being to come into existence. Now, that is a biological fact. Every month, a woman's body does prepare for the reception of another human being. The child did not just pop into existence of its own will to go and impose its rights on the woman's body. The body was hospitable the conditions were met, and the child is the result of that. Now, with great power, and yes, she's got the autonomy and all the control, and that fetus is dependent on her, but with great power also comes great obligation. If I'm in a plane and I am completely dependent on the captain has complete power over the situation. He doesn't have the right to suddenly say, well, I don't want these passengers on my plane anymore, and hop through the plane and start shooting them. And that's ultimately what happens in the case of abortion, that a woman is saying, I have the power, I have the body, I have the ability to kill what is dependent upon me. Why is the child dependent? Because they're younger.
Passenger plane involves consent to an obligation, not an obligation that's externally imposed. And I'm also curious about, and this is for you to consider because I'm not really asking Kristine, when does the woman's obligation end under this supposed system of all abortions, you're now the parent, so you have an obligation. When does it end? If there's a 90% viability rate at the 25th week, can a woman just rush in and have a C-section and be done with it? Can they just under that system, when do they meet their obligation? Are they required to absolutely carry it to term? I don't know. But the thing is that as soon as we take the right to choose away, we now have to impose upon individuals, just as the condition was imposed upon them. Consent to sex is not consent to pregnancy, and consent to pregnancy is not consent to remain pregnant.
Okay, I'd love to answer that point. Yeah, you're right. Consent to sex is not consent to pregnancy. However, the situation doesn't need to be consensual for you to understand that there's a human being that is involved in the picture. For instance, if you were you owned a boat and you had somehow accidentally left the door to your yacht gate open, and somehow either a fetus or a child, it could happen. No.
Let's make it a fetus. It's more fun that way. It's a person, isn't it? Okay. Just like everybody else.
A child wandered in. So in this analogy, if a child had somehow accidentally wandered in, or let's make it even more graphic, let's say that somebody had gone and dumped this child onto the boat, and you find yourself out in the middle of the lake about an hour, 2 hours a day away from the shore, and suddenly you find this child. You say this child is completely dependent upon you, is going to be dependent on your food and your resources. Do you have the right to take this child and slit their throat, throw them overboard to the sharks because they're dependent on you? Because you didn't consent to this child being there.
No, but I have the right to call 911 and have somebody else take responsibility, and if it dies afterwards, it's not my fucking problem.
Sure, but in the meantime...
I apologize.
In the meantime, before someone else can relieve you of that obligation, you don't have the right to just cut off all.
I'm not forcing anybody to take the
children.
obligation. I'm just not necessarily accepting it, and I don't accept the fact that if you put your baby on my front porch, that I'm obligated in any way to take care of it.
But you are obligated to not kill them.
This is where the line gets drawn. We want to make sure we get to the rest of the questions, but yes, you are obligated to not kill them.
Okay, next question is from Stacy Gonzalez from Houston, Texas.
Okay, I want to first say that the video was completely unnecessary and disgusting, and I'm completely offended. But also, on top of that, and there's children in here and all sorts of other situations, but I was on birth control. I used condoms. I did not want to be pregnant. I did not choose to be pregnant at all. I guess by having sex, I guess I did, but whatever. I didn't choose to be pregnant. I took every precaution I possibly could. I got pregnant. Then I had an almost nervous breakdown because I did not want to go through that. At that time, I was much younger, and ended up with a spontaneous abortion. My body rejected it. My doctor said because of my partial nervous breakdown, it was my fault pretty much. Do you think I belong in prison?
Okay. First of all, I want to answer the first point that you didn't choose to be pregnant. when I'm playing baseball with my nephew, I can say I did not choose to break the neighbor's window. I just consented to playing baseball. However, our choices do have consequences. Now, it's not to say this is a punishment, but there are consequences, natural consequences to our choices. And so if I am consenting to have sex, which does have the possibility of conceiving a child, just like baseball has a possibility of, breaking a window, then there is a natural consequence that has to follow that. You need to meet the obligation of that responsibility, and killing the child isn't an option. As to your actual question, a spontaneous abortion, like a miscarriage, is similar to sudden infant death, where human beings die naturally. It does happen. Just because human beings die naturally does not mean that they were not human beings, or that all human beings of that age and stage of development are not valuable.
Hang on. I want to do this one. I love you, Stacey, I really do. If I break my neighbor's window, yes, I have an obligation to take responsibility for that act. Terminating a pregnancy is analogous to taking responsibility for the process in which you became pregnant. But if my neighbor doesn't fix that window, and it rains, and it ruins his carpet, I'm not now responsible for the carpet. And if it shorts out his television, I'm not now responsible for the television. I'm responsible for the immediate causal response to my action. And my position is that terminating a pregnancy is a demonstration of responsibility. It is an empowering position that allows people to have maximal choice over what responsible action they are going to take, whether they carry it to term or whether they abort it.
But you're assuming. Your argument is assuming that the fetus is not a human being.
No, it's not. It never has. Not once all night long have I assumed that it's not a person.
But it does, because if there was an obligation or situation in which you suddenly became obligated for a born human being, you would not say, well, I'm meeting the responsibility of my obligation by killing them. The same way the child that came on the boat, you don't meet your obligation.
Yes, because I reject your ignorant straw man of killing them as directly analogous.
What is it? If it's not killing them, what is it?
The fact that they die is not necessarily the same as terminating pregnancy.
If you're actively going in there and you're decapitating, dismembering, and disemboweling them, how is that not an act of killing?
It is, but that's not the sum total of all abortions, first of all. And second of all, that is dependent entirely on your assertion that it is a person with full personal rights.
I'm not asserting it. Science has already made that clear.
No, science doesn't assert personhood.
Science does not assert personhood, but we derive personhood from science. The same way that we did when we were defining the rights for black people or for women or for anybody else who is different than us. If they are human beings, then they are worthy of personhood.
Rights don't come from science.
In the interest of time, we have time for one more quick question and one more quick answer.
No.
It's been deferred to P.Z. Meyer.
Well, that last bit it was just a final straw there. So several times in this talk I've heard Kristine assert that science has decreed that the embryo is fully human at fertilization. I'm in this field and I haven't gotten the memo. Okay, when you cited your authorities, I'm very familiar with those authorities, Keith Moore and so forth. Those are people who wrote introductory nursing texts in the 50s through the 70s. So my question would be, have you talked to any modern developmental biologists? Because I guarantee you all of them would say that your argument is full of shit.
Thank you for that. I actually have a recent white paper that, for those of you who don't know, white papers are scientific journals, by Maureen Klondike. I also have about 50 embryology textbooks that all have the exact same definition of a human being, that human life starts when fertilization begins. I don't know of any reputable textbook or scientific journal that has argued otherwise, and please, I would love to see it. I'm sorry?
You are distorting that text. You're taking a very narrow genetic definition of human and applying that to the person. I can guarantee you that if you talk, for instance, go talk to John Burton or Yamanaka, the recent Nobelists in stem cell research, and they will tell you that this is nonsense, that you cannot so discreetly define a human being with a single instant to find it fertilization.
Okay, well, like I said, I have dozens of embryonic textbooks that would beg otherwise. But if you're right, let's just assume, if it's true that science does not know when life begins, then we must err on the side of caution, because otherwise we could be taking a life.
Okay. Thank you very much. Now we get to the point where each side has 2 minutes to make a summarization of their arguments, and we'll again begin with Matt.
So, I've got 2 minutes, and I had a prepared closing, but I think I'm going to change it up a little bit. I fully expected the discussion of personhood. My position is that personhood is ultimately irrelevant. And what I tend to see, I was a fundamentalist Christian for a number of years, and my position on abortion, unlike some people, actually changed before I gave up my religion. But for many people, after giving up religion, they still hang on to these ideas, and they lead the evidence toward a conclusion that they're trying to reach. I am not, by the way, I just realized that that is potentially similar to a description of Kristine. That's not my point. My point is that we are guided by our biology. We love babies. Well, some of us do. There are others who don't. We have this intuition about what is a person and what's a future person, and isn't it all just the same, and don't we have to care for it, and isn't this killing, and isn't this something that I can just neatly and simply summarize in one little quickie sentence and be done with it. And the problem is that there's more to it than that. There's the rights of more than one individual to consider, and in that situation there is a powerful burden to overcome before you can impose on somebody else's rights. If we're going to do that, we don't just err on the side of caution because we don't know. We better have a damn good reason. And the fact that it's another person making use of a body is not a damn good reason. It may be sufficient for you to consider someone immoral, or maybe even a moral monster, but it is not enough for us to impose that moral opinion on people as a matter of law and turn women into criminals for protecting their health.
Thank you. Kristine, 2-minute summary.
We do need damn good reasons if we're going to be denying people their rights. We do need damn good reasons if we want to impose our moral view of what a human being is on the preborn human. I have argued tonight from the basis of science that from a biological standpoint that the embryo and fetus is a human being. I've also argued that there is no valid reason to deny them personhood because when we look at the differences between the preborn and the differences between the born, we all vary in these differences from the beginning of fertilization to natural death. I've also argued today that Matt's argument is only stands if he's right that the preborn are not human beings. When we look at science, we ultimately have to conclude that this is the case, that the preborn are human. Therefore, there are basic obligations that follow. The violation of bodily rights is a very serious issue. If the fetus is a human being, then they have a bodily right as well. And it does not do to just say, well, we don't know when human life begins. We don't know if the fetus is human or not. Imagine a constructional engineer saying, well, I don't know if there's somebody left in the building, but I'm going to go and blow the building down anyways. No. If it's a human being, then we must be according them the similar rights, basic rights to at least not be killed. And that's a conclusion, but I think my computer has gone to sleep, but I have a quote from Christopher Hitchens, where he has said that ultimately the candidacy of the human being the science has shown that a human being is a candidate member of our species. And I agree with him, and I think that is why secular humanists and thinkers who are thinking on this issue need to look at all the questions involved and come to the same conclusion that I did. If it's a human being, then secular thinkers should not support the right to abortion.
Thank you, Kristine. Let's give them all both a big hand.